Good evening. Welcome. I'm KARIN Wolf. I'm the director and librarian of the JCB, and it is such a pleasure to welcome you here this evening. I hope that many, if not absolutely all of you, have or will be using the JCB's extraordinary collections. I'm probably saying things you already know, but I'm going to say them anyway. As a library devoted to the early Americas since the middle of the 19th century, John Carter Brown's collections have been developed to address questions about this essential place and period in so many respects, the very foundation of the modern world. The JCB's fellowship program brings annually almost 50 scholars a year through our physical and digital doors, and many more researchers from our campus, home, and from all over the globe to think through the multidimensional peril and promise, vigor and violence of the world made by colonialism. As we gather in the reading room here, I want to note two things. First of all, how very grateful we are for everyone who supports the JCB's work and the work of research and knowledge making here. And secondly, how much events like this one contribute to the intellectual communities that make that knowledge manifest. So we're particularly delighted to, and find it especially appropriate to, host this event to celebrate and discuss Andrew Laird's new book, Aztec Latin. And I'm going to stop here and turn the podium over to Professor Jeremy Mumford for a full introduction. Thank you.
Thank you, KARIN. It's such a privilege to be here tonight and to be associated with this event for a book that I already love very much. I want to thank the John Carter Brown Library, the Department of Classics, and the Department of Hispanic Studies for sponsoring this event, and very briefly introduce the first speaker, David Lupher, Emeritus Professor of Greek, Latin, and Ancient Mediterranean Studies at the University of Puget Sound, the author of a number of very influential articles and publications, and above all, the book from, what year was that? I don't have the year, but Romans in a New World, Classical Models in Spanish America, a book that had a huge impact on me and a lot of readers, and essentially opened up the whole field of the interaction between people, not just learned people, not just literate people, but people of all classes and races interacting on the level of ideas and culture with the classical world, which so much work has been done since. So I want to thank Professor Lupher for being available for this.
Thank you very much. I believe it was Sabina McCormick who first informed me back in April of 2006 that there was another classical scholar who was infiltrating colonial Latin American studies. At that point, I was already familiar with Andrew's fine first book, Powers of Expression, Expressions of Power, Speech Presentation in Latin Literature, a theoretically sophisticated study that informed my teaching of Latin epic and prose fiction. Later that year, I got hold of his edition and study of Landívar's Rusticatio Mexicana, and the next year I first met him when he invited me to participate in his Mellon workshop at the Newberry Library in Chicago. We met again in 2010 at the memorable Alter Aroma conference at the Getty Villa, and also at subsequent conferences at the Sorbonne in 2013 and University College London in 2018. Also, during our stays in Oxford, my wife Elizabeth Vandiver and I have gotten to know Andrew as a friend. I am also very grateful for the help and encouragement Andrew has given me on my own work, and I'm honored that he has sought my input on drafts of his long-awaited, groundbreaking book, Aztec Latin, whose launch we are gathered here to celebrate today. I have learned much from reading drafts of this superb book, and I have greatly enjoyed reading the very handsome final version. I'm going to suggest how Andrew's training and output as a classical scholar has powerfully and valuably informed his second life as a scholar of 16th century New Spain. But first, I want to express my admiration for the way that he has continued his earlier scholarly trajectory as well. His article on the Pseudo-Virgilian culex in a 2020 Oxford collection impressively extends his work on dramatic narrative of 2 decades earlier, while also engagingly illuminating this strange poem's metapoetic kaleidoscope, to use his term, by deft allusions to Hesiod and Humbert in one breath, and to William Faulkner's fruitless attempt to induce Raymond Chandler to declare who actually done it in The Long Sleep. Also, when teaching an undergraduate course on the ancient novel, I found that his article, The True Nature of the Satyricon, generated lively class discussion with its challenge to the standard assumption that that novel was composed during the reign of Nero. When a classical scholar of Andrew's caliber turns to the study of early colonial Latin America, he will quickly demonstrate advantages that are evident throughout Aztec Latin. One of these advantages is, quite simply, a mastery of the classical languages, particularly Latin, that formed the basis of the humanist system of education that the Spaniards adapted to a New World setting. In the first instance, there's simply the fact that a classical scholar will be more at home in Latin than most scholars of Latin America, though I hasten to add that Latin Americanists stand a better chance of knowing Latin and being fully aware of Latin and Neo-Latin literature than is the case of scholars of British North America, as I have painfully discovered over the last 15 years or so, as my own scholarly trajectory has moved north to New England and early Virginia. Thus, in one footnote to Aztec Latin, Andrew had to correct 2 scholars who, when they, quote, fatally confused manus, hands, with manes, the ancient Roman spirits of the dead. True, in the ablative case, the forms are the same, but the howler, and so one can understand how the mistake happened, and these 2 scholars, whom I'm not going to mention by name, naturally went astray there, but the howler needed to be pointed out. Given that facility in the Latin tongue was so important for the friars and for their indigenous students, it is no bad thing that a scholar engaging with such texts be armed with a similar facility. But while I'm on the subject of a classical scholar's linguistic abilities, I must record my deep admiration for Andrew's informed awareness of the importance of grasping all 3 languages that were in play at the Colegio de Santa Cruz de Tlatelolco. I envy Andrew's engagement with Nahuatl, much as I envied Sabina McCormick's efforts to learn Quechua. Indeed, Aztec Latin is a book that would have deeply interested and impressed Sabina, one of many reasons to regret her early death. Not only is Andrew Laird, as a Latinist, at home in the Latin taught and practiced at the Colegio, but he is also attuned to classical allusions and citations embedded in such texts as the petition the rulers of Azcapotzalco sent to Philip II in 1561, many of which Greco-Roman echoes are likely to elude non-classicists. But Andrew's Latin expertise is by no means limited to the products of antiquity. He has long demonstrated a deep familiarity with the humanist Latin of the Renaissance, and this has enabled him to achieve a much fuller grasp of the sources of Aztec Latin than previous scholars have attained. In his book, this expertise in Neo-Latin bears impressive fruit in his identification of the hitherto unrecognized source of the Nahuatl translations of Aesop's fables, clearly designed as a kind of mirror of princes for the rulers of indigenous communities. Earlier scholars were content to assume that the Latin translation of Aldus Manutius was the source of the Nahuatl version, and this led them to assume that departures from the text of Aldous must reflect indigenous interests and modes of thought and expression. But Andrew cast a wider net and hauled in the actual source. The translation of Aesop by the great 16th century German classical scholar Joachim Camerarius, noted in his time for his translations of Greek authors into Latin, and still famous for his pioneering edition of the plays of Plautus. Those who study the humanist learning of early modern scholars and readers are aware of Camerarius, as I recently discovered when I got diverted into some work on Cotton Mather. But Camerarius appears not to have been on the radar screen of colonial Latin Americanists. Andrew's juxtaposition of the Latin Aesop of Camerarius demonstrates with painful clarity that the Nahuatl version's departures from the Aldine text had their origin not in indigenous concerns and ways of thinking, but in the work of, as he put it, a professor of classics and theology far away in the university town of Tübingen. Andrew Laird's work explores the products of a humanistic rhetorical educational system that, upon deployment in New Spain, ensured the enduring vitality of central aspects of Greek and Roman culture, while at the same time proving flexible enough to accommodate cultural realities that would have been profoundly alien to the ancient Greeks and Romans. Thus, both Latin texts produced by indigenous scholars and Nahuatl texts derived from Latin offer fascinating glimpses of a complex cultural interaction that lay at the heart of the training of indigenous youths to become effective administrators in their own communities and to exploit to the full the most impressive and effective modes of interacting with and petitioning their imperial overlords. This raises, of course, the question of the extent and nature of indigenous agency in a context of imperial domination and exploitation. While it would be easy to assume that the humanist classical culture that formed the educational training of these future native administrators was simply another aspect of cultural imperialism and the suppression of indigenous modes of thought and expression, Aztec Latin offers many demonstrations of how the humanist writings produced by the Franciscan educational program managed to express and embody genuine native style concerns and ethnographic data. In the final page of his stimulating book, Andrew not only acknowledges the problem that Renaissance humanism acquired its global reach as a consequence of imperial expansion, but he also points out that historians of scholarship have too often regarded their field, quote, as a domain largely remote from social praxis, end quote. This seems to me a danger that he has deftly dodged in his own book. But then he adds a corollary that he knows that I have found a bit unsettling. He adds that, quote, the study of Greco-Roman legacies in the form of classical reception is even more problematic, not least in colonial contexts, because it presupposes the centrality of classics, which it also seems to affirm, end quote. And he adds that, quote, such a centripetal methodology serves the ends of classicists above all, and regularly leads to a distortion of historical realities. In that respect, practitioners of classical reception are all too comparable to those early missionaries in the Americas who subordinated whatever knowledge they acquired of indigenous cultures and languages to their own end of promulgating the Christian message, end quote. Now, given that my own work over the past few decades has very much been classical reception in colonial contexts, I'm naturally sensitive to the suggestion that my endeavors have been all too comparable to those early missionaries in the Americas. For that matter, I would invite Andrew to explain more fully how his own work on New Spain, crowned but by no means limited to Aztec Latin, manages to evade the classical missionary label. After all, it is my impression that the very first article on classical receptions ever to be published in the very distinguished journal Classical Philology was none other than Andrew's 2014 article, Nahuatl and Caesars, Classical Learning and Bilingualism in Post-Conquest Mexico. Whether Andrew chooses to take the bait of my agonizing over these few sentences in his book's conclusion, I trust he will not take this classical receptionist missionary's comment as a detraction from his superb and groundbreaking book, a book that I admire greatly and have felt privileged to see taking shape over the past several years. Thank you.
Next, I'd like to welcome Professor Louise Burkhart, Professor of Anthropology at SUNY Albany, whose 1989 book, The Slippery Earth, Nahuatl Christian Moral Dialogue in 16th Century Mexico, was similarly path-breaking to Professor Lupher's book, and who's published a number of many other books and articles, including 2 volumes of edited and translated Nahuatl theater. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. I want to thank Andrew, first of all, for inviting me to be here, and the JCB. It's nice to be back and be welcomed here once again. I wish Andrew had written this like in the 1980s when I was starting out, because it would have been really, really useful, but you were not such a child prodigy, I guess. So we're really, very happy to have this book available now going forward. I want to just give a little reflection on what I see as the really significance of this work for people coming from colonial Nahuatl literature and language who do not have the classics background that is really essential to understanding our colonial field. So I just kind of go through what I see as the 5 top takeaways that came to my mind after I finished reading Aztec Latin. First, just how important the Renaissance humanist Latin education that indigenous scholars received at the College of Santa Cruz and other mostly Franciscan centers of learning was to the very existence of Nahuatl literacy and Nahuatl literature, from just the initial attempts to translate Christian doctrine and sermons and biblical readings into works like the Aesop's Fables that David just mentioned, and so many other works, including the corpus of Nahuatl drama that I worked on for a long time. And just knowing how these people were educated and the models of learning that they were immersed in that education. And also, it's for people working on Nahuatl linguistic studies. Andrew paints a very clear portrait of the connections between early colonial grammars and vocabularies and Latin models, especially Antonio de Nebrija and the whole linguistic background and how that fed into the documentation of Nahuatl. And third, his commentaries on the Florentine Codex, which is the single most important source for early colonial Nahuatl civilization and understanding pre-colonial Nahuatl culture. It's probably the single most important thing that got me out of archaeology and into ethnohistory. how the Latin education, again, of these indigenous scholars who worked on the text subtly shaped how they went about that work. And he also notes important divergences between sort of Sahagún's framing of the work and purpose of the work and what's actually in there in the Nahuatl as written by the indigenous contributors. For example, how Sahagún frames Book 6 as a study of rhetoric when it is not really, doesn't really function like that in Nahuatl. He also gives some wonderful documentation of how both indigenous scholars like Fernando de Alvarado de Sosomoc and Chimal Paine and people of mixed heritage like Fernando de Alvix-Xochitl, whether they were writing in Spanish and Nahuatl, they drew on their classical education and used Latin texts as models for their work, as sources of exempla and little stories and examples, and just the way they shape their narratives to present often pre-Columbian history as if it were a classical story. And last, as David pointed out, how valuable it is to have this study and the example texts of the really amazing Latin erudition of people like, especially Don Antonio Valeriano, and others who had such mastery in Latin that they could just, carry on conversations, write anything they wanted, write really amazing letters to the kings or emperors, and very masterfully make the case for indigenous rights or whatever they were petitioning it for, using classical modes of expression and also indigenous Nahuatl modes of expression. Andrew points out how this sort of very intense, stylized self-deprecation that the writers use seems to be more of an indigenous than a Latin model of expression. And I'm just going to take a little detour away from the text that Andrew was working with and tie it a little bit into my own work, and then we'll tie it back to Aztec Latin. Is most of the works he discusses are coming up to the first half of the 17th century with Alba Ixtlilxochitl, Mijangos, Juan Bautista Viseo, the sort of fluorescence of writing in Nahuatl centered around the College of Santa Cruz into about the 1630s. So what happens to Latin in the later colonial period? One vehicle for the persistence of Latin in indigenous life is church music, which does not really play a role in the book, but it was a place where Latin was heard by and communicated to all indigenous people, men, women, children, commoners, nobles, and it's a place where there's a continuity as every indigenous church community had a choir. If you were in the choir, you got tribute reduction, so that's a really good incentive to sing. Had a choir master who was literate, who organized church activities, festivals, plays, and so on. And we have written records of church music, both printed and manuscript. The first image on the left is actually from Guatemala, but it's by an indigenous choir master. And he writes in the manuscript in Nahuatl, so he was a Nahuatl speaker. And this comes into my most recent work, which was with 18th century Nahuatl passion plays, which we have 6 extant dramas. They are all derived from a common source. They're very similar, but also have substantial differences. This is a tradition that was probably circulating since the early 17th century. and picking up local versions and adaptations as it went along until it was suppressed in the mid-18th century, and probably came out of that same lively literary production in Tlatelolco in the early 17th century. And into the mid-18th century, there's a persistence in the use of Latin choral music in the texts. And it's a deliberate indigenous choice by the indigenous playwrights and performers to maintain this. If we look at Spanish language texts from the same place and time, we don't see that. And the plays, one reason why I link them back to Tlatelolco in the early 17th century is they have a clear connection to a Latin book, a different Latin book that was published in Tlatelolco in 1604, which is this Passion chant book. It has musical versions of texts from each of the four Gospels on the Passion of Christ and a couple other texts as well, and was prepared by a Franciscan friar, Juan Navarro, who worked in Michoacan. He wasn't working with Nahuatl speakers, but his book got used. These 18th century Passion plays, a couple of them precisely quote the beginning of his Passion according to Matthew, as if the play is actually Passion according to St. Matthew, which it is not. It is drawn from a lot of sources. But in the case on the left, you can see the copyist even copied the little signs. There's also an S for solo and a C for chorus that show up as that little Nahuatl text continues. So a direct connection into the mid-18th century from a book from 1604. So they're obviously making a deliberate attempt to carry on this Latin choral tradition. I just pulled together a few examples of texts in Navarro's chant book and how they actually show up in Nahuatl. Usually you just get a short passage, the first few words of what was probably a longer chant. Sometimes the Latin is quite garbled because it's been copied and recopied, somebody reading out the text while another guy writes it down, and the copyists are not going to be the Latinists that we had back in Tlatelolco in 1600 or so. But it's good enough, it's close enough to be tracked down to the actual gospel passages that were annotated here by Navarro. And there are other choral sources and Latin hymns also that show up. They can be quite controversial, and this particular play is the one from Tlatlauquitepec in Tlaxcala. The text refers to Jesus at the Last Supper breaking bread and sharing it and saying, this is my body. In that play, that's the only reference to the blessing and transformation of the bread is the Latin chant. That was one of the most controversial scenes. That was one of the things that led to the plays being suppressed. They didn't like indigenous people performing what was the essence of the Catholic Mass. But it's there in the Latin. Just to kind of try to bring this back to Andrew's work and Aztec Latin in the earlier period, I think why keep singing in Latin in the mid-18th century when very few people know much, except maybe the choir masters who are arranging this music for church and festivals? I think it still carries on this sense of authority and legitimacy and credibility for indigenous knowledge, indigenous performance, and indigenous Christianity. And even just writing the Latin on the manuscript, like where they copy that beginning text from Navarro, says, yeah, look, we know what we're doing. This is an authoritative text. We know Latin. We misspell half of it, but we can deploy a knowledge of Latin to show that we know what we're doing. We deserve to control our own texts and our own performances in this context where they're seen as threatening to church authorities. So also, Nahuatls were still not just using Latin, but using song and music to sacralize their religious performances and to communicate sacred messages. And many people in the audience would not understand the Latin, exactly what the message is, but they would associate it with the sacredness of their church life and this, tradition going back as long as they had records of their own adaptations of Christianity. And these are adaptations made in the 16th century by indigenous scholars who wrote the first Christian texts in Nahuatl, recorded the Florentine Codex, and wrote music in both Latin and Nahuatl for indigenous Christian festivals. So Latin does hang around. We don't see quite the same things that we see in Andrew's book, but it maintains a sense of this impressive, authoritative legitimacy of, for indigenous culture, even that late. Okay, thank you.
Finally, and very briefly, I want to introduce the main speaker, Professor Andrew Laird, the John Rowe Workman Distinguished Professor of Classics and Humanities and of Hispanic Studies, and the director of the Center for the Early Modern World. Andrew is a classicist who, in a very prolific career, his first 3 books were all about the Mediterranean, the classical Mediterranean, powers of expression, expressions of power, ancient literary criticism, Italy and the classical world. And it was only in the 2000s that he turned his attention to the Americas. Since he has come to Brown in 2016, he's been focused on this subject of the Nahuatl interaction with the classical heritage, and I want to welcome Professor Laird to speak.
Thank you, Jeremy. And I'd like to thank the JCB and KARIN WULF for hosting this event, the departments of Classics and Hispanic Studies, their respective chairs, Joe Pucci and Sarah Thomas, for supporting it, as well as Jana Chavez and Natalie Leschenko for their work behind the scenes. And I'm also deeply grateful to Louise and David for coming to talk today. Carlos Fuentes wrote a novel called El Naranjo, the Orange Tree, some of you may know, and part of it is narrated by Martin Cortez, son of the conquistador Hernán Cortez and his Mayan translator, La Malinche. And early in the novel, Martin describes his excitement as a teenager in Mexico City when he hears some inquisitors using Latin, and he enthusiastically tries to join in, repeating the words, etc., until he's beaten up and arrested. He explains to the reader that his mother had taught him Latin expressions like that because, as an indigenous convert to Christianity, she was impressed by the fact that the Spaniards had a special language for religion different from that used in everyday life. And that fictional incident was what first led me to wonder what native Mexicans in the 1500s really made of Latin and what it stood for. But the direct impetus for this project came later. I was fascinated by a few surviving letters which have been mentioned that Nahua or Aztec authors wrote in Latin only 30 years or so after the Spanish conquest. And the authors belonged to the indigenous nobility. The Spaniards had educated and trained them to govern their ancestral principalities. And the letters, which are lengthy and elegant, are valuable historical sources. But there's a far more important point that arose from them, which initially I didn't see. I completely missed it. And it's the fact that only a small number of people who can read Latin ever actually write it. That's always been the case. So it follows that the culture of Latin among the indigenous elite must have been much bigger than this handful of 7 or 8 petitions. And the evidence, let me see, I think I'd better use this. The evidence for that culture of Latin is here in the John Carter Brown Library and many other places. The abundance of Christian texts in the Mexican language of Nahua, which were accurate translations from Latin. And the Nahua writers who made those translations were therefore Latinists de facto. That seems to have been overlooked for a long time. And that's a key point of Aztec Latin. And the more I looked, the more Latin there was in the broader culture of Nahua writing after the conquest. Even the Florentine Codex, as Louise mentioned, was written by Indian Latinists. Sahagún repeatedly emphasizes that. And within the Nahua text, there's ample evidence of their European learning. Nearly all these texts were prepared at the Imperial College of Santa Cruz in Tlatelolco, where Mexican scholars were trained. And that's the setting for most of my book. Louise has identified the main takeaways, and I'm very happy with the takeaways she identified. And what I'm going to do is share the fundamental insights behind those takeaways on this slide. And the first is a unifying perspective. Recognizing the latent operation of Latin draws all kinds of different fields and sources from early colonial Mexico together. The Franciscans' methods of mastering Amerindian languages, for instance, were connected to their views on education and evangelization because they were deeply influenced by Erasmus. And it was Erasmus's insistence on the need for linguistic proficiency in a Christian society which was what inspired the energetic program of translation from Latin to Nahua. And that directionality was crucial, and it drove nearly all the scholarly activity of the friars and their native collaborators. Secondly, Nahua literature is a Christian literature. Despite this, many scholars have long focused on a few later texts which are thought to be rooted in pre-Hispanic Aztec traditions, or even to be pre-Hispanic, though these texts too contain conspicuous Christian elements. It's interesting how those texts are often championed in isolation from the original context in which they were produced and from the manuscripts in which they were transmitted. There's another major feature of Nahua literature which people keep quiet about. Just as the vernacular literatures in Europe, which had hatched out of Latin in the Middle Ages, initially contained Latin conventions of genre, rhetoric, classical references before they came into their own, the same happened with Nahua. And this text, the Colloquies on Peace and Christian Tranquility, was possibly the first original composition, sort of literary kind of composition in Nawa. And you can see it highlights in red the names of ancient Greek thinkers who are introduced, like Plato and Pythagoras, as well as church fathers like Origen and St. Augustine. But while European literatures took a couple of centuries to materialize like this, the early arriving of printing in Mexico and the relentless copying of manuscripts accelerated this effect, so that Nawa evolved much more rapidly than European vernacular literatures to be rich and varied within 50 years of the Spanish conquest. And the third most important consideration I want to point out is the linguistic and cultural status of the indigenous scholars who worked at Tlatelolco. As speakers of Nawa, they were of great value to the friars, but they were in an unusual diglossic situation. Linguistic immersion in Latin in their education meant that inevitably some of them had a more systematic and wide-ranging command of Latin than of their native language. The students were aware of their noble ancestry, but they had no personal experience or memory of the world of their ancestors. They were born after the conquest, separated from their parents at an early age, and fully Christianized, so that their outlook would have been much closer, in many ways, to that of school students in Europe than that of the Aztecs. A consequence of these points is that Latin and the European forms of knowledge to which it offered access supplied the default framework for understanding the Nahuatl language and the pre-Hispanic world in the 1500s, and hence much of what is still believed about the Aztecs. There are many examples, but I'll end with this famous symbol, the sign of an eagle devouring a snake that the god Huitzilopochtli gave the Aztecs for the foundation of Tenochtitlan. The trouble is that there is not one pre-Hispanic or even early colonial depiction of that myth which shows a snake. The snake's first appearance comes in the rather late Codex Urbain, and it's obviously due to European influence. But what was the reason for it? There's no such image in Christian art or literature, but Mexican scribes and illustrators would have come across print marks and Latin sources which describe eagles struggling with snakes, because it was a topos in Latin literature. And a key one is Cicero's account of the omen of an eagle tearing a snake apart, which prompted Gaius Marius to make the eagle the emblem of the Roman SPQR. And that civic context, interestingly, parallels the sign for Tenochtitlan. So native artists and chroniclers began to introduce the snake to make the Mexican sign more readable for Europeans, and perhaps also for themselves. To conclude, the Latin petitions I began with were few in number, and they never circulated in New Spain. Translation from Latin to Nahuatl was far more significant, and that led to the most enduring and exciting consequence of the Indian Latinist training and their greatest legacy, the creation of a new literature in the Mexican language. I want to stress that I'm not trying to diminish the importance of Mexican culture before the conquest, but I am questioning the way that scholars have imposed idealistic projections of their own making on Mexico after the conquest. There are so many examples of this, like caricaturing the native chronicler Chimalpayin as a ghostly voice from the pre-Hispanic past just because he wrote in Nahuatl. Chimalpayin wrote in Nawa not because he was primitive, but because he was an innovator who sought to demonstrate that the language could work as a vehicle for learned writing to compete with Spanish or Latin. The tendency of some colonial historians to set what is indigenous in opposition to what is European all too often involves privileging of what is authentically indigenous. And that way lies a kind of condescending Orientalism. Thank you.
Do you want to just, oh yeah. So we have time for questions and answers. And I wanted to just start by asking Professor Laird if he wanted to address Professor Lupher's challenge about his own complicity in ethnocide and forced conversion.
Yes, thank you for remembering that. I think the answer to the question was actually in the earlier part of David's talk when he mentioned that Latin Americanists have a decent grasp of Latin when compared to their North American counterparts. But I think the nature of classical reception depends a lot on what people who say they're doing classical reception get up to. I think David is probably well aware that for most Americanists and Spanish American, North American historians, he is a cultural historian of the Americas. It's only to classicists that he's regarded as a classical reception scholar. I think that the field of classical reception is going through an interesting transition, and the best direction it can go is to serve other disciplines, not merely regard them as target fields where you find evidence of classical interference, but to make up for the fact that now we're not in the position we were 100 years ago when historians of Europe and historians of the Americas knew Latin, often Greek, and sometimes Hebrew. So I think there's a very important contribution that classicists can make, and it's a unique selling point for them to enter into fields like modern languages, modern literature, modern history, early modern history. It's the idea of everything being sucked into the field of classics, which I'm skeptical about. I hope that answers the question.
Are there any questions from the audience? Jose?
Andrew, could you tell us a little bit more about the purpose of this education in the College of Santiago Tlatelolco in the context of, you comment a couple of times, you say, it has been said that there was an attempt to create an indigenous clergy, and there is no evidence of this, and it is important to understand that it was more. So it is not a failed attempt to create an indigenous clergy, but to educate the future governors. Would you tell us a little bit more about why you emphasized that correction from previous scholarship to your book?
Yeah, I think it is important to make that correction, so I'm glad you've brought it up. For about a century now, the idea that the Imperial College of Santa Cruz was a seminary has been knocking about because of the French historian Robert Ricard, who I think must have made that assumption because the teaching was done by friars. People have also dropped the word imperial, including me, to fit it into the PowerPoint, but the college's title was the Imperial College of Santa Cruz de Tlatelolco. It was sponsored by the Holy Roman Emperor and the first Viceroy of Mexico. And the idea wasn't original to Mexico. There was already a college of Santa Cruz in Granada in Spain, which had educated the sons of emirs after the Reconquest with exactly the aim of reprogramming them into becoming Catholic governors and administrators who were not just linguistically adept at Latin, Arabic, and Spanish, but also culturally adaptable too. And I think that it's just a misperception as a result of the Franciscans being brought in to do the education. Now, the other thing is the emphasis on Christian literature in the college. This was the Franciscans who saw civic education and a Christian society and evangelism as completely coherent objectives. We now might think of this as a sort of distraction from the mission, but given that Erasmus was who deeply influenced them, was interested in the role of religion in society, it was natural that you'd get that overflow. And why would intelligent missionaries miss an opportunity to have native speakers who could produce the translations they desperately needed because there were so few friars?
Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
I wanted to follow up on your last question. First of all, thank you. I'm delighted to learn about this new book, to see this new book celebrated. But when one has the tools of literacy, right, you've been trained and you've become literate and you've been exposed to the church and you've been exposed to sort of the civic education, you have education, one kind of maybe wants to read forbidden books, books that were not sort of provided by the Franciscan friars. Erasmus obviously has very strong opinions about what one should read and what one shouldn't read. Have you found in your research any evidence of these populations, these indigenous populations, reading illicit materials or less than recommended materials and on some level engaging with them, engaging in some sort of textual conversation, criticism, something of that sort?
Yes, there is not a lot of classical material was actually discouraged. I mean, the person who became suppressed was Erasmus himself. And that's, the turn against Erasmus happened later in New Spain, conveniently for this educational project. Although Erasmus's school textbooks were not affected by the Inquisition, nor was his education of a Christian prince. Erasmus was very happy to recommend classical authors to Christian students because he was appalled at the poor quality of writing style that you got in the Vulgate and in early Christian texts. And there does seem to be it seems as if the students in Tlatelolco were able to read quite widely. We have to be aware that some of their classical quotations could have come from Erasmian anthologies like the Adagia. But the most interesting cases, I think, are the indigenous chroniclers who weren't educated at Tlatelolco. Tezazomok, Diego Muñoz Camargo, were citing very unusual texts, not ones that were banned, but ones that, because as I said, most classical texts weren't, but ones that were recherche and interesting.
Professor Bodell.
Thanks, and Andrew, thank you, Andrew, and thank you for the question because it largely anticipates mine, and you may already partially have answered it. I was going to ask whether the Latin that made it through to the Nahuatl was all filtered through Erasmus and church fathers, and if so, whether the colonializing thought structures were not really those of classical antiquity, but of the early Middle Ages.
They were really the Christian humanist Renaissance. So neither strictly classical nor medieval. The trivium was taught at Tlatelolco. People always think that's medieval, but the teaching of the trivium went through the Renaissance and beyond. Most interestingly, the textbooks for the teaching of grammar, logic, and rhetoric were Renaissance Northern European textbooks. Titelmann's Huneeus for logic, and the influence of Rudolf Agricola. So it was state-of-the-art Renaissance education. It has to be mentioned that a number of the missionaries were Flemish and French. One of the accusations leveled against Tlatelolco was that it wasn't sufficiently Hispanizing the students. It was Christianizing them and turning them into humanists, it seemed, but not into Spaniards.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you. I was wondering, to what extent do you think that the access to Latin allow indigenous elites to gain a better knowledge of Europe's antiquity and also the origins of Christianity, and how maybe that even had a political use, because that made them aware that Europe had a pagan origin also, and that Christian teachings had changed through history and had been shaped by Christian authorities.
It's a very interesting question, and the man who can best answer it is sitting just in front of you. David Lupher's book, Romans in the New World, goes into exactly those questions of what classical antiquity would have meant, not just to Spaniards, but also to indigenous scholars. We can't always discover exactly what they would have thought, but one thing that I perhaps didn't emphasize sufficiently in Aztec Latin was the importance of St. Augustine's City of God, which was very popular reading. There were commentaries and editions by Vives and Erasmus. This was really the template for Sahagun's Florentine Codex, the kinds of questions asked and the polemics against paganism in Sahagun's prefaces. And any indigenous scholar trained in Latin would have been reading that, and I think how they might have aligned themselves is a different question, and I think David does have a different take from me. I think the first chroniclers identified themselves more with Romans, pagan Romans, than with the barbarians that the Romans were invading. But either way, it's interesting because there's an independence of positioning that way.
First, I want to say thank you so much for writing this marvelous book. I thought it was just a magnificent piece of scholarship. What interests me, your emphasis is all on these elite Nahuatl speakers, or elite Nahuatls, and they're being trained in the Imperial College to be better governors. Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering if in your scholarship and in your research, do you find where they do go back to their home villages and how they put these ideas into effect? And is there any evidence of this having influence on the common people that they were governing?
It's an interesting question. I think the first place I would go would be to Barbara Mundy's book, The Death of Tenochtitlan, The Birth of Mexico City, because in that book she focuses quite a lot on Antonio Valeriano, who was from Azcapotzalco and wrote one of those long Latin petitions, in fact, the most elegant one. And he became a judge in Tenochtitlan in the 1570s and seemed to work very closely with the liaising between the Spanish administration and the San Juan Quarter of Mexico City. Certainly you can trace other governors. There's a very big collection of letters in Spanish because most petitions were written in Spanish. There's and some in Nahua, and a larger number of Nahua ones than there are in Latin. So I would stress these Latin petitions were very exceptional. But you can certainly see that the figures who wrote those letters I mentioned at the beginning, Antonio Cortés, Totoquehuatzin, Pablo Nazareo, are recorded elsewhere, and how they govern their principalities, that there are other attestations. So the system was in place, and it did seem to be working for as long as the Spaniards needed it, which wasn't very long.
Thank you.
I want to let you know that there's a flyer at the front with a discount for buying copies of this book. And it's also an ebook in the Brown Library. Any final comments? Or any other questions?
Questions for Louise or David, perhaps?
Yeah.
I think I've said my piece to David.
Yeah.